Morning, everybody. Crappy, wet Mondays, late as usual. And welcome to the News Agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's Northeast reporter, Jeremy Armstrong. Morning, Jez.
Hello there.
This is the People's Pay-Per-View, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. Those of you listening on podcast will just have to ask yourself whether holding elections guarantees no dictators. Spoiler, it doesn't. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on an astonishing move by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to stand down if it leads to peace and his country can join NATO. And it comes after a week in which Donald Trump repeatedly accused Zelensky of being a dictator and trying to hold on to power undemocratically, which presumably he followed up by telling a kettle how dark its skin was. Now, today is the third anniversary of the outbreak of war in Ukraine. We're not going to ignore it. There's a drumbeat of sort of international attention on it as leaders are holding summits and heading to Washington later this week. On Wednesday, we're going to have a repeat of the roundtable we did last week with our defense editor, Chris Hughes, and the US editor, Chris Buckton. And we're going to look more in depth at the anniversary then and at whatever will inevitably have exploded by Wednesday. So we are going to cover it, but it'll probably be on Wednesday. Come back for that. But today, there's a few other things domestically to focus on this side of the Atlantic. And first, I want to take us to page 19 and revelations that the police force has been trialling the use of artificial intelligence, AI, to transcribe interviews with witnesses. Now, Jeremy, can you take us through this? Because I suspect nothing screams dystopian hellscape quite like the failures of speech recognition being applied to legal testimony.
Yeah, indeed. It's hard for Chuck and Stablery, who think it's a really good idea. So basically, when they get victims of domestic violence in, their view of it is this, that the use of a digital assistant means that the detective can listen and concentrate more on the answers which are being given, what would then form the evidence in terms of the transcript of the interview. If you have an AI digital assistant which is actually doing everything automatically, as you're probably aware, what puzzles me about this slightly is that you're recording it in any event. What the AI digital assistant does is obviously makes a transcript automatically from that recording.
Yeah.
So the argument for it is that the police officer can focus more on what the interviewee is saying, in a sort of very journalistic way, in a sense, rather than making notes and trying to focus on the actual accruing of the evidence, if one can put it that way. The problem is, as one of the victims is quoted in the piece as saying, is that does feel very impersonal at the start of an interview. It makes you feel very uneasy because you're putting yourself in the hands of an AI assistant, which makes it, as you said, just have a kind of dystopian feel about it, and it kind of removes the human element to it, doesn't it? And that I think is probably the last thing you'd want to do in that context. Having said all of that, their argument is that you get a more accurate account of what the witness is saying, and the police officers can focus more on the victim. So their argument is actually the opposite to what the criticism is.
What do you think, everybody? Have you had any issues with AI or voice transcription, voice recognition? How many times has something beeped at you and said, well, I'm listening, and then heard entirely the wrong thing as you've screamed at them that or on a multiple choice phone conversation where you're going, no, I don't want that. No, I want to speak to someone. And the voice has just recognized something different. Hopefully, things have evolved a bit, and what the police are being able to do here is, a different level. But part of the reason, I should think, Jeremy, that when a victim is, and they're using this in domestic abuse and serious crime cases, right? They're not trialing it on the wishy-washy stuff. It's the serious stuff. Part of the reason that as a victim, when you're giving your witness statement, being able to see someone writing it down gives you a sense of reassurance that what you're saying is being heard, and also that it's important that this is not the time to fudge things or embellish or to make stuff up. Someone's writing it down. It's a police officer. They're taking it seriously. You tell the truth. They write down the truth. It loses that aspect, doesn't it? That even if it's performative, even if it's only just something that you just happen to see, a police officer doing, it's going to affect, I'd have thought, like the victim has said there, the confidence you have that the police are doing what they ought to be doing.
Yeah, it's a trust issue, isn't it? As it always is in those cases, in particular in the context of sex offences, because one of the key issues is that so few people feel brave enough to come forward in order to get a prosecution in the first place because they don't have confidence in the system. Um, so anything that adds to misgivings around that, I think, has to be a subject of great examination and forethought. The counter argument is that it is more accurate. That's the counter argument, that you're getting a transcript of exactly what is said, and if they're done properly and they're done electronically, you get the questions, you get the answers, and it's a verbatim account. It's a verbatim transcript, as I say, of what is being said. So that's the counter argument to that.
Yeah, and I mean, Richard says accuracy will be high if the right models are applied. Ambiguity over certain words, as propensity for that in English, will likely need manual fixes. What Jeremy says is important. It does improve the listening comprehension. I would just say, Jeremy, I don't know if I'm just too old-fashioned, but whenever I interview someone, if I'm not making in the course of our careers, tape recording has become far more, and digital recording and the ease of those devices has become far more common and prevalent than it used to be. If I'm not actually physically writing down the notes, I'm not thinking about it in the same way. It's not that I'm sitting there with my pen down and the tape's running and I'm able to think about the questions better. That doesn't happen. I tend to think about the questions better when I'm writing stuff down. It kind of goes in and logs in a different way. Maybe that's just my brain. Do you find that or not?
Yeah, I think that's true. I was discussing that this morning with a colleague, actually. I think that's absolutely right. I think that when you're making notes, it makes you focus a little bit more. On the answers, because you're seeing them in front of you, even when you're doing it in shorthand. Obviously, the counter argument in that context, I guess, is that you can, if you're doing that and you've got your head down, you may be engaging less with the victim. That's the counter argument. I don't agree with that. I mean, I think anybody in that situation, if it were me as a police officer or a journalist, you'd want to make a note, wouldn't you? That's always my instinct on it, because I think it's easier when you go back over things to reflect a little bit, and you do reflect. I think you're right. I think you do reflect as people are talking to you a little bit more when you're actually seeing it in front of you.
Yeah, you can't just sit there and stare at people in the face while you're asking them difficult questions, for hours either. You have to break eye contact to give them space sometimes to answer.
Yeah.
A bit more honestly. There's times, isn't there, in an interview where you make a point of writing notes, even though maybe you don't need to write those particular notes, because you're giving them a bit of a break from the pressure of being scrutinized so much. I don't know. Leslie says, will it take into account that the right questions are being asked? I suspect there'll be a problem. Like you say, it's more accurate because you're not going to have this situation where, like I just referenced, where a police officer thinks, well, I don't need to write this bit down. Right? It takes everything, and they can compare it. If there are problems, like Richard said, with voice recognition, some words, they can compare it with the tape, and they'll know if there's a problem. But it just strikes me that it's probably something that would actually cause more work for police officers, in a sense. But then again, how many times have we all been sitting in court cases, Jeremy, where the police notebook has turned out to not be quite as accurate as it could have been?
Yeah, I mean, and then again, the counter argument to that, of course, is that this takes that out of the equation, doesn't it? Because you've got an electronic account, if you can put it that way, because it basically takes the verbal word and transcribes it instantaneously. That's the joy of that system. The speed of it actually should theoretically take work out of it, I would suggest, because you get a transcript immediately and you get the chance to go through it. And I guess if you get a break in the interview, you can go through the transcript, can't you? You can reflect on what is being said. Yeah. I sense, to be honest, Susie, that we're discussing something which in 3 years, 4 years time will just be a given.
Yeah,
and they'll do it in every context.
Yeah,
I think we're expressing misgivings about something which, before you know it, it'll just be accepted, and we'll be talking about it in court cases, and they'll say this is the AI transcript of it that was done, verbatim. I think that's the reality of it.
Yeah, as Steve says, could officers become over-reliant on it, thereby missing something important? Now, police notebooks do go astray. When I was arrested, and I had someone was, I was a bit up and down, so I was saying stuff to the police officers when I probably shouldn't have been. I should have been keeping my mouth shut. But when we got to the station and I got booked in, the police officer showed me my notebook, his notebook, and said, "You said this, didn't you?" And it was kind of, that was me. I did it. I confess it all. Sign here, sort of thing. And I had said words to that effect, but that wasn't my quote. And it was just, as a journalist, I looked at that and went, well, no, I wouldn't have said it that way. I said it this way, and that's not quite right. And so I didn't sign the notebook and so on. So it is better to have something that's a bit more totally focused on it. But one of the things that really jumped out at me, Jeremy, was that the owner of this company that runs the AI said it allows officers to focus more on answering the questions. The thing that bugged me about that is that the police officers should be carefully gathering evidence. That's what the questions are, it's evidence. And if they're allowing someone else to gather the evidence, then, you know, when it's just oral, what else are they going to be allowing computers or AI to take over from them at some point? I mean, I know we're screaming into the wind, this is what's coming, especially with a lack of resources and so on. You know, are we just dinosaurs, do you think, railing against change? Or is this something perhaps which we're right to be concerned about because it hasn't gone through quite as much evolution as we have, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an experiment at this stage. It's a possible future projection, if one can put it that way, in terms of what they're going to do and what they're going to use. I think you'd have to say that it's all about the means by which they use it. If they're making notes at the same time, if they are doing it properly, if they are doing it assiduously, if they do still have the compassion that you need in interviews in that context, that it's explained to the victim that it's an aid memoir rather than anything else, and it's just endeavouring to ensure that everything's accurate. Then I think then that will work properly. I would suggest. I don't think you should see it as a proxy. That's the thing. I don't think it is a replacement. I think it's an assistant. I think it's designed to back up, the video recording that they'll already have. So it should theoretically speed things up, actually, from the victim's perspective.
Yeah, and it should be a little bit clearer, perhaps, maybe, and be of use in court cases. You know, you're catching out what someone said better than perhaps when a policeman's taking a note of it, a police officer. Who knows? But, AI note-taking coming soon to a police station and newspaper near you, I suspect, which means that my shorthand will go the way of my handwriting, which is right out the window. Now, there are some of you may have heard yesterday. We need to move on to the main story of the day. And yesterday there was an election in Germany, and it was won by the centre-right Conservative Party, which is known as the Christian Democrats. They're now going to have to form a coalition about how to rule. But meanwhile, the big winner was the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, which is considered far right and has gained so much support, it is now the official opposition. I do not, I am sure, need to point any of you to Google how the far right rose to power in Germany last time they did that. Now, Jeremy, any government that has to form a coalition is going to be less stable by its nature. Is it possible, do you think, that having the AfD in opposition is going to actually create kind of more unity against them?
Yeah, you've got to bear in mind Germany's proportional representation always has been. So you do have, Greens and kind of essentially parties which are completely sidelined in the UK in terms of representation in Parliament and all of that. They've got a more broad representation under the German system. That said, it is really, really concerning that a party, there were basically experts on the radio this morning saying that there are certain members of the Alternative for Deutschland party who are actually on the radar of the secret services because they're deemed to be so extreme. And that kind of sums up the situation in Germany. It is really alarming, I think, from the German perspective. And you will get a coalition against them without a shadow of a doubt, and they've already said that. They're complaining about it because obviously they've got the biggest vote they've ever received. They're saying that they should be represented properly in the coalition are already saying that they're going to try and sideline them. It's an extraordinary situation, but it's one which is happening right across Europe, and obviously, let's be honest, we've also seen in the UK, so it's no great surprise in that regard.
No. So how much do you think we need to be worried about seeing similar here? Like you say, we don't have the same electoral system. It's not PR. I don't know how you can sideline the main opposition in the country, but good luck to Germany with that one. Now, Keir Starmer gave a speech yesterday to Scottish Labour Conference, was talking about Nigel Farage and the threat that he and Reform pose. They've been very tight with the AfD, although they don't share all the same policies and so on. This is something that's going to give him and his supporters quite a lot of encouragement, isn't it? You'd have thought.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. He's already spoken about that. He's already spoken about seeing himself as, as the alternative to the Conservatives in terms of opposition, and obviously the ultimate goal he sees it is winning an election. God, I mean that is a pretty scary thought, isn't it? I think. But when if you take a step back and analyze what's happened on the world stage, the type of things that Trump says, the type of things that Elon Musk in particular has been saying, how they've kind of stolen the agenda and already recreating the world order, aren't they, in terms of their attitude towards NATO? It's no great surprise that people look at it and think, well, A, kind of gives them a platform and legitimizes that kind of really extreme politics because they've got power, and B, makes them confident to make the kind of statements that Farage has been making about not just being the official opposition but actually having power. So it's a lesson, I think, isn't it? It's a parrot down the mine, however you want to put it. It's a warning for the parties in the rest of Europe to really take note and acknowledge that's a threat, and you've got to counteract it, really.
Yeah, I'm sure we can discuss another day whether actually becoming Prime Minister might be the most certain way to kill the political career of Nigel Farage. But speaking of elsewhere in Europe, there have, of course, been plenty of murders by Europeans over the past week, but it's those involving migrants which get a disproportionate amount of attention. And in France, all the focus has been on an Algerian man who stabbed someone to death and carried out a knife attack on police. Now, Jamie, can you explain a little bit to the viewers first what happened here? Because I suspect there will be an awful lot of partial information out there on social media. Like it says here on the headline, France tried to deport this guy 10 times before the attack took place. And I just want to get the truth straight out there, I suppose, for our viewers, so they know exactly what's going on.
It's a classic battle, isn't it, between the authorities and the legal system, so that he's used an asylum claim in order to remain in France is what the authorities are saying there. I mean, he was on a watch list of some description, what we would describe as a terror watch list. Being convicted last year of an offence which was terrorist linked. Briefly in custody in Mulhouse, then put under house arrest. The French authorities' perspective on this, and this is obviously, I have to stress, the government perspective, which has been put out there in the public domain, is that they endeavour to deport him, and they couldn't because of his fighting that legally, as it were.
Yeah, and I think as well there may have been
some back to Algeria, didn't they? And they couldn't get him back to Algeria. Is what
there's some blame, it seems, for the Algerian embassy in France, which wasn't really engaging with the request to deport this chap. Now, what happened was, because he was considered a suspect, he was under house arrest. And part of that meant he had to go to the police station. The only time he could leave the house was to go to the police station and report. He went and did that. And while there, obviously lost his tiny mind to some extent, stabbed one person to death and attacked several police officers who are now in intensive care. Now, he is mentally ill. The French authorities knew that. He's not a well person. He was shouting Allah Akbar, apparently, during the attack. There's an awful lot of crossover with things we've seen here, as well as, of course, attacks on German markets and shoppers and so on, where someone originally from another country, perhaps not terribly with it mentally, has become vulnerable either to radicalization or just the wish to become violent, has gone off and done something gruesome and appalling. But, and it feeds into, doesn't it, all this disquiet people have about immigration and so on. And even though this guy, he wasn't looking for work, he wasn't claiming any benefits, he wasn't being welcomed, he wasn't integrating, wasn't stealing anybody's job, and like that, he was ill, he was violent, he had been provoked by some unpleasant rhetoric, and they gets all this attention and so on. And this one has not been helped by the Algerian embassy, but it kind of leads people, doesn't it, to argue for the Donald Trump solution in a way of forced deportations, and that's the kind of thing that takes in, everyone else from that country or linked to that country in some way.
Yeah,
it's not something which
it's difficult, isn't it? there's no question whatsoever that feeds into what we've just been discussing, in terms of the average man thinking that's not right, reading that story thinking it's such an extreme example if it's true, and people want to see a solution to that, don't they? That's what it boils down to. And the easy solution is to do what Donald Trump's doing and do that kind of nationalist argument about just kick them out, put the wall up in Mexico, etc., etc. Really, extreme rhetoric, which feeds this growth of the far right parties. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah, but it does come out as just rhetoric in the end, because most people may not realise, but Donald Trump is deporting people at a slower rate than Joe Biden did. He's not being as tough as he talks about. He likes provoking this, but it is not less good at actually doing something about it. And I'd be interested to know what our viewers think about this. Are you concerned about the rise of the far right in Germany? Do you think this is something that is going to come here? Do you think reform is going to do better in the polls? Because there seems to be some kind of a sea change. And, the new Labour government, which is going to be in for 5 years, we assume, it seems to be standing alone, really, in Europe at the moment to some extent. And we've got this sort of situation. One of the most telling electoral maps I saw this week, Jeremy, was about Germany and the old East and West Germany. Very different lines, and they have very different experiences. So the old East Germany was more likely to vote AfD, but less likely to have any immigrants. And it was largely because, and they're more likely to have poverty because, all the businesses, all the jobs are in West Germany. Most of the migrants are in West Germany, but it's East Germany that has voted for the AfD, and they're the ones who've got more poverty, more concerns and fears about some of these changes that are taking place. Up there in the northeast, it's easy for us down here in the south just to generalise and say, well, it's the bleak north up there. But what's support like for reform, and how much of it do you think is linked to jobs, poverty, immigration, things like that?
There's a real irony actually when you look at the support up here, because reform's done particularly well in places like Sunderland, and Sunderland, is benefiting from 10,000 jobs from a Japanese car maker right on its doorstep in Nissan. So you try and work out the logic of that. So if you follow the reform arguments logically through, then the Japanese car maker on your doorstep presumably wouldn't be welcome, because that's all the money's going to going to a foreign investor effectively. It's an extraordinary kind of mix really in the northeast in that regard. But you're right what you say. I mean, that rhetoric which you're talking about in terms of foreigners taking jobs, etc., even though they've got the Japanese car maker on the doorstep, that's where it's prospered in places like that, where a bit like East Germany, where you have the highest unemployment, where you have people without jobs, where you're feeding on that kind of concern. And there's a chap saying Teesside's the same. It's places where there is that there is a correlation without a shadow of a doubt, as there is in Germany, between unemployment statistics, opportunity, and that rhetoric, that argument that says people are coming in and taking jobs. It's a very, again, very, very simplistic way of looking at it, I know, but that's effectively where it prospers.
Yeah, and what the view there was just saying was that up in Teesside, the place is full of anger, and it's anger which has fueled a lot of the rise of the far right in Germany and in France and across Europe and here in the UK with reform. It's places that have been left behind, people that are cross about the conditions they live in. Places like Clacton and places that have voted for Nigel Farage and for his lot. And it does seem that anger isn't really going anywhere. So let's just finish a little bit on how Keir Starmer is supposed to tackle this. And if anybody out there has got any great ideas, let us know. I'll pass them on to his office. There's a massive variety of factors that lead to terror attacks and to voting intentions. Starmer's been tacking right, really, in regard to immigration, recently releasing footage of detainees being deported in order to look tough. But while that may play to some of those voters in Sunderland and Teesside in the old Labour heartlands, it's a real risk of upsetting the more liberal Labour support, more middle class stuff, which he's come to rely on, and could be turned off voting for him to some extent if it goes on. This week, he's going to be shaking hands with Donald Trump. How tough, Jamie, do you think he's going to have to be? How effectively, if he tries to, is he going to be able to separate himself and Britain's support for Ukraine from Donald Trump? Our major defence ally. It's a country we rent our nuclear weapons from. It's a place with which we do a lot of trade. he has to make friends with this guy, doesn't he? But at the same time, he's having to define himself as not being like that guy.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I mean, there's a dilemma there for him, but I think essentially what's going to happen is he's going to have to say when he's going to increase the defence spend in order to ally himself to what Trump has asked for. How you do that and how he's going to make the sums, I don't know, but I think that's what he's going to have to say. At the same time as making quite clear that he doesn't share Trump's view about Ukraine and Zelensky and what he said about him being a dictator. And I think you can do both, and I think that's what he'll do. And you haven't got much choice there, really, I don't think, because you can't. The alternative, if you analyse it, is to sell Zelensky down the river and the Ukraine, and you can't do that. But what he can do is say to them, right, okay, we've got plans which we're going to put in place where we are going to increase our defence spend, and we believe in NATO. What's most extraordinary about the entire Trump situation, I think, is the fact that he doesn't seem to have any knowledge of the history of NATO and why it was brought in, and why it's so dangerous to undermine that, really. So we, as Europeans, all accept almost it's such an obvious thing. It's such a given, isn't it, that NATO was brought in to secure peace after the Second World War and trying to ensure that we never see that again. One of the most extraordinary things about the invasion by the Russians is that in Europe we are seeing a war again, which we thought would never happen in our lifetimes, obviously. And NATO was brought in order to secure that peace. And what I find extraordinary about the Trump attitude towards it is that he doesn't understand that, really, and why Europe is so concerned about that. I mean, the Germans have already said that overtly and very succinctly today. The guy who's going to become the chancellor is basically saying that the US has become an enemy of Europe. I hate to say it, but that's the reality. Is so many leaders across Europe see it, and who can blame them? What Starmer's got to do is try and accept to a certain extent that Trump in his relationship with Zelensky, that's like a personal thing, and try and take that out of it and try and reach some sort of agreement where he's saying, yeah, okay, we agree to spend more on defense, but we've got to try and tone down the rhetoric with regard to Zelensky and how we come up with some sort of peace deal.
Yeah, well, if anybody can find a way to straddle, I agree with you, and also I don't agree with you, then it's a barrister. So fingers crossed that Keir Starmer will manage it. Leslie says, why should Starmer have to tell Trump anything? Trump's not running the UK, is he? You wouldn't have thought so, but you look at the papers. He does.
There's the rub.
A disproportionate impact, as he did last time. And it's got to be said that part of the reason, of course, that America was always the senior partner in NATO was that previous presidents had understood that if Europe fell, America would suffer. America would have trade problems. America would lose money. America would have issues with its own immigrant population, many of whom have come from Europe originally. The lotion on its skin, Paul says, if Trump asks for the nukes back, does Starmer just launch them? It wouldn't surprise me if Trump does ask for them back as part of a deal with Putin. There's a whole situation with nuclear weapons and so on in Ukraine that was supposed to be a buffer zone and had to give up its nuclear weapons and was supposed to have some security guarantees as a result, but then got invaded anyway, and that's all a nightmare. I'm sure we'll get onto that maybe on Wednesday when we look in a bit more depth at Ukraine and what's going on there. Now, we have managed to find some good news in the world. There's quite a lot of it in the paper today. There's many bits of good news. I was finding it difficult to pick one, but this is the one we chose. Here it is. I don't know about you, but I love seeing those benches on a beauty spot that's been put there in memory of someone who really loved it. I always read the inscription. I wonder about their story. And there's one of them laid out for you in the paper today. Now, when William Batcott, Bill, as he was known to his mates, died at 68 from leukemia, and this is about 7 years ago, his family memorialised him with a bench at one of his favourite spots, overlooking the sea at Bull Bay on Anglesey, where he often went on holiday. Now, that was 2018, and they thought no more about it until this January, when his daughter was contacted by someone who had found the bench 75 miles away in Drigg in Cumbria. Now, for those of you whose British geography isn't as good as it should be, that is across a huge chunk of the Irish Sea. Now, the person who found it rescued it from the beach for them, carried it back up to the cliff, and it's going to be installed in the family garden, hopefully chained down. A replacement is going to be put on the spot in Anglesey by the local council. But the lovely bit here, Jeremy, is the inscription on the plaque on Bill's bench said, for me, it has to be the sea. And it seems like even in death, he was desperate to be one with the waves, wasn't he?
It's a beautiful story, isn't it? It really is a lovely story. I'm like you, I do tend to read them a lot because I'm on the coastline here, so they're all along the Northumberland coast and beautiful spots. And my favourite spot in Whitley Bay and all the way along the really wild northeast coast. So I do love them like you, and I love to read the inscriptions on them. The lovely thing about that is that someone actually took the time, having seen it on the beach, to go away and look up his name and find out where it had been placed and you know, turn detective, if you like, to track down his relatives on social media. So the real hero of the hour is the lady who found the bench and didn't just think, oh, what a shame, but actually actively did something about it and tracked down the relatives in order to reunite it. And the council where it's disappeared, what's the other really nice aspect of the story is that they've already said they're going to make sure that a new bench goes in the spot where he used to love sitting. So it's a really nice story.
It's fantastic, and perhaps a clue to all of us to make sure if you have a bench, chain it down. Climate change is not going to let you have your benches sit there for too long. Right, thank you, Jeremy, for taking us through all that. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. Like I said, come back on Wednesday. We will have another special in-depth look at Ukraine 3 years on after the invasion and just ahead of Keir Starmer's visit to Washington and Donald Trump. There will be loads to unpack there with our defence editor and our US editor, so come back for that. In the meantime, everybody, till Wednesday, stay safe, take care, don't vote far right. See you then. Tatty bye.
Thank you.